Hello, and welcome to the 7th lecture for English 421Y Technical Writing. In this video, I will briefly describe the visual instructions and procedures assignment, discuss strategies for producing a visually dominant document, and provide a few examples. For the second part of Unit 2, you will be creating a separate document from your textual instructions that presents similar information but for a slightly different audience and situation, and using primarily visual information. The setting can be the same as in textual instructions, that is your current internship, but I want you to imagine a scenario, audience, and purpose that are better suited to visual instructions. It's okay if they are similar, but you will need to strategically match your genre and rhetorical situation in a way that makes sense. You also need to select a predominantly visual genre, whether print or digital, and then determine the tools and media that will work best for your needs. While the information contained in both the textual and visual documents can be similar, you are allowed to change your angle to take into account the different possibilities of textual and visual media. That is, you might visualize one complex step in the larger process that you described in your textual instructions. Not only is that okay, it's probably unavoidable. A key thing to remember is that you can include text in your visual instructions, just as you can include images in your textual instructions. But the meaning should be communicated primarily by the visuals rather than by the text. Let me explain what I mean by that by turning to Graves and Graves, Chapter 8. Depending on the purpose, they argue, visuals can be used to clarify the text, support it, or supplement it. They then identify 4 methods for relating text and visuals in order to create meaning within a document. Where is that? There we go. So the 4 are stage setting, redundant, complementary, and supplementary. Stage setting is when you use visuals to communicate information that is different than the text on the same page, but is used to forecast the content of the text ahead. That is, you present a visual slightly out of context, but then the user understands it later on. Redundant visuals use visuals and text to convey exactly the same information in order to repeat the key ideas, especially for processes or concepts that are complex and challenging. So here's an example of redundant. You have text and images that explain the same thing. Whereas stage setting, you can see up here, they have a toolbar, and that toolbar might be on one page, and then the explanation of the tools itself might be on the next page, or whatever. So stage setting and then redundant. Next is complementary. Complementary is when text and visuals each provide slightly different information, and both are required to ensure full understanding. The 2 modes together communicate the complete idea better than either would alone. So here you have the instructions, and then you have the screenshots of the software to which the instructions refer. One of these on its own would be incomplete. Together, they communicate information very effectively. And then finally, supplementary. One of the modes is dominant, conveying the main information, while the other mode mostly confirms or elaborates the point. This method is the most common way to integrate text and graphics, often with the text being the dominant message and the visuals serving as an example. In an ideal world, all text would have complementary text and visuals, while redundant and stage-setting visuals would be used strategically and with deliberate purpose. Because we don't live in an ideal world, most documents have a supplementary use of visuals. That is, the visuals are not important. The text is important, and the visuals are simply there to supplement the text. For the visual instructions assignment, I am deliberately asking you to make visuals the dominant mode of conveying meaning, a role that, as Graves and Graves note, usually goes to text. We will return to the complementary, redundant, and stage-setting methods when we work on page design during Unit 3. But for now, I want you to think about how do you make visuals that stand out, that are either complementary with text or that stand out on their own, that only require supplementary text. That is, the images are primary and the text is supplementary. The text is not conveying the meaning. The biggest mistake I see people make with this is to rely too heavily on text to convey the meaning and then to have supplementary images. That's not what we're trying to do. We're trying to do the opposite of that in this project. To illustrate this, I want to turn to one of the most famous examples of predominantly visual instructions, the Lego set. And I chose Star Wars because I'm a nerd. You should probably have figured that out by now. As you can see with this example, there are no words at all in Lego sets. There are numbers, there are letters, but there are no words. And this is a 228 page document that only has words at the beginning and the end when it describes what the document is actually about. How do they do it? How do Lego sets communicate such complex information in a way that anyone of any age, obviously this is a huge set, but the same principles of Lego building manuals are used for sets meant for young children. How do they do it? You'll be considering this question. I want to take a minute to go over a few aspects of this. In the past, I've had people do an activity for this. I decided to cut it, but there are a couple things that make Lego sets effective. The first is goals are clearly identified. The current objective is always communicated through the occasional orange boxes that you'll see here, and there's a bunch throughout if you leaf through this. They show the final product next to the section the user is currently working on. This juxtaposition instantly identifies the current goal in relation to the larger goal. So you know this is what you are building. This is what it's eventually going to turn into, but for now, you're building this frame. And then this first step, this very first simple step, is related to that frame. Steps are numbered. Each step in the process is clearly identified with large white numbers, while sub-steps within a larger step are identified with yellow boxes or smaller numbers. So you can see here, you have the main steps for each number. As we scroll down, you can see here, you have sub-steps. 1, 2, and 3 must be done and then connected into step 8 of the larger process. The third thing that Legos do very well is change indicates progress. Progress is shown through the accumulation of each step, which is done by contrasting one step or sub-step with the next, so you know to compare what you have to what the instructions show before moving on. This is a key grammar of Lego instructions that is odd but quickly becomes natural. You know that this piece is going to turn into this piece, which is then going to turn into this piece. And as it progresses, you see the accumulation of the pieces. And it starts to take shape. If you're ever confused, you can go back to a step and say, oh, okay, well, mine doesn't look like that. I need to make sure that it does before I proceed. The fourth principle is that there's consistently repeated elements. Even though what the user is building changes every page, the design elements stay consistently throughout. Impressive, after only a few pages, you have seen all the major design features needed to read the entire 200-page plus manual. It uses the same ideas, the same placement, the pieces change, the structure changes, the steps change. But as you go through it, you are learning how to do it. For instance, here is something that we haven't seen before. A green box within a yellow box. But you know already, because the yellow box is within the larger blue box, that must mean the green box needs to happen before you finish the yellow piece and before you put the yellow piece onto the larger piece. It's teaching you how to read the grammar that it's using. That grammar is never taught anywhere else. It's never stated, hey, look, this is the grammar of this document. Instead, you pick it up as you read. Occasionally, you might get confused, but something like Legos, they've gotten so good at developing instructional sets that require no text, that only use visuals. So again, I ask, how do they do it? I've just explained some of these principles, but it's the grammar that they built. Together, these elements create a consistent, simple, and compact visual language. The trade-off is that because each step is broken down literally piece by piece, the manuals end up being long and somewhat intimidating. This is a 228-page manual for a toy. That's a lot. It's a cool toy, but it's still a toy. If you've ever built a Lego set with a child, you know that this can create problems. How many people have had a child start crying on them because they want to play with it rather than sit through watching someone build it? I've been that crying child. I've also been the uncle building the set. However, the benefits of this approach is that you can print the same manual anywhere in the world without worrying about translating the instructions. You can reuse the same design for almost every Lego set, since the only thing that changes is what you are building. Whether this is a product being shipped in the US or China or somewhere else, whether you are building a Star Destroyer or a castle, Lego sets, the same manual ideas, the same language can be reused. So unlike Lego sets, the instructions you are developing must make an argument. Legos, you're just building something. You are making an argument as to why your instruction sets should be followed. That same idea of a visual grammar, a visual language, carries over to visual design of instructions. I've asked you to read briefly this piece, Alan Chong's Visual Rhetoric, Making Arguments Using Elements of Visual Grammar, which goes over visual rhetoric, which is the study of visual arguments. And it gives us some language for thinking about how and why arguments work when they're essentially only images. Chong's article uses the term visual grammar, which I've just been using, to describe how this persuasion works. And it is comprised of two groups of things. What he calls components of visual grammar: size, shape, color, tone, position. And then what he calls relations of visual grammar: contrast, proximity, hierarchy, balance, symmetry. Both of these things should be familiar to you from Unit 1. However, at this point, I want you to think about these again, because Chong does an excellent job of showing how these two aspects of visual grammar work together to help designers create effective arguments. They aren't just ways to make things look nice. They aren't just ways to make people want to read things. They are presenting an argument, and how you use both these components and these relationships of components together make different arguments. His analysis of the Toronto Environmental Alliance poster explains how this argument is constructed using these simple components and relationships in ways that are both obvious and subtle. I won't go through his entire detailed analysis, but basically he uses these ideas of components and relationships to explain why this poster works when it's contrasting two proposed plans for a light rail network and a subway expansion plan. He uses these concepts and explains how the designers deliberately construct an argument by using these simple ideas such as balance and white space and color. Finally, I want to end this lecture with a brief word about genre. You have free reign to decide how best to communicate your instructions or procedures to your audience, but I strongly recommend selecting a genre that is current and relevant, that is familiar to the audience, easy to develop, and that plays to your strengths. To demonstrate the importance of these practices, I will use a recent genre, it's less recent now, but it still works, that you have likely seen: BuzzFeed's tasty recipe videos. They're ubiquitous now. When I first started using them, they were relatively new, but the idea is still pretty good. So let's click on one. classic glazed donuts. I'm going to turn the music down a little bit. First, tasty videos are a relevant take on an established genre that uses the current trend of sharing short viral videos on social media to change how people get recipes. Since most BuzzFeed's audience has a smartphone, these videos are designed specifically to be accessed by phone via a range of different social media apps. Now that audiences are familiar with genres of minute-long, hyper-visual, point-of-view recipe videos, and you can see here it's all shot top-down, you only ever see the person's hands. They explain each step as they're doing it, but they do so without using any words or much text. We're used to seeing this, so this has caught on. This has become a ubiquitous way of explaining recipes. Third, these videos are relatively easy to develop. You can see there's no famous actor, there's no Martha Stewart, there's just a pair of hands, and then bowls and saran wrap, and they use a little bit of text, but not much. There's no voiceover, there's no narration, there's music in the background, but it's simple. Well, they definitely require considerable editing because there's tons and tons of cuts. You can see right there, they sped that up. They're more likely cheaper than a traditional, cooking show. They're also more visually interesting than a typical video. And they're compelling. They're making a visual argument. You're not just being told, flip the donut. You're seeing those donuts go into the oil and turn brown. And I don't know about you all, but I'm hungry just watching this. Fourth, BuzzFeed plays to their strengths by reconceiving the recipe as a short viral video, almost exclusively communicated through posting on social media. These are not the best instructions. Oftentimes they don't explain the technique that's required. Oftentimes they leave information out. If you've ever tried to replicate one of these videos, and I have, they can be frustrating. But the goal isn't necessarily to make you want to sit down and use this by hand. They're pointing you towards this information. They didn't used to do this, but now they also have text instructions on the Tasty website. Obviously, if you're clicking on it on Facebook, you're not going to see the text, but now they have the text instructions. Tasty has become its own genre of cooking videos in only the last 2 or 3 years. And you can see now that it's also, in some ways, gone backwards. It includes the text as well, so you can go back and forth between the two. Clicking on Facebook link to go to Classic Glazed Donuts, you might not necessarily read the instructions, but if you actually want to do the instructions, now you have the text instructions. So I give this example to you just to illustrate how important genre is. There are so many other ways to do cooking videos. Why did the point of view camera above the hands without any narration, why has that become so ubiquitous? It works for smartphones. It works for tablets. It works for sort of a quick culture where we share videos. People are more likely to watch and share a tasty video than they are to cook something using a tasty video as the instructions. That doesn't mean they're the best instructions, it just means they're one example. You can choose a more conventional genre like a poster or an infographic, or you can select a more recent and popular trend, something like an animated video or whatever. Whichever you choose, make sure it emerges from your scenario, fits your audience and purpose, and would be appropriate in your setting. That's it for today. Good luck developing your visual instructions.